Welcome so much to the next installment of our We Own the Future event series. This one is entitled Building the People's Banks. Each of these We Own the Future events are based on a chapter in this book. So please, like I just mentioned, if folks haven't gotten a copy of this yet, we are offering 25% off the book at Dissent's website, and information for this is in the chat. Tonight, we're really lucky we have a lot of co-hosts for this event. The co-hosts are the Democratic Socialists of America Fund, the New Press, Dissent Magazine, and for this event tonight, DSA's Democratic Socialist Labor Commission, Save Our Postal Service, Labor Notes, and the American Prospect. Thank you to everyone who's joined us from those publications and organizing groups. If folks have missed previous events from this series, we will be posting links in the chat box to those events, and all of them can be found on Dissent's Facebook channel. So tonight, our focus is going to be on David Dayen's chapter of this book entitled Building the People's Banks. So we'll be talking about the fight for postal banking and other ways of democratizing our financial system within the context of how we can save the post office and help these workers in their ongoing struggle. So with that, I want to go ahead and introduce the panelists for tonight. Like I mentioned, this is about David Dayen's chapter. So we have David Dayen with us tonight. He is the executive editor of the American Prospect magazine. He is the author of Chain of Title, How Three Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud, winner of the Studs and Ida Turkle Prize, and monopolized Life in the Age of Corporate Power, released in July. He lives in LA. We also have with us two postal workers. Melissa Rakestraw has been a letter carrier for over 20 years. She is a shop steward with the National Association of Letter Carriers and is a socialist organizer. Courtney C.J. Jenkins is a clerk at the United States Postal Service and a local officer for the Baltimore Local 181 of the American Postal Workers Union of the AFL-CIO. During his 12 years at the Postal Service, CJ has worked to help educate and organize his coworkers to realize their true power as working people. And finally, I'm Flynn Murray. I'm a writer and labor solidarity activist based out of New York City. I'm involved in the Save the Post Office campaign, and I serve as the publishing director of Dissent magazine, whose podcast Belabored recently focused on protecting the post office. So folks should definitely check out our latest episode that features some amazing postal activists. So I'm gonna say a couple like housekeeping things about how we're gonna run tonight's event, and then we're gonna get into the Q&A with our amazing panelists. So the first half of this event is going to be a 30 to 45 minute discussion generated by questions I am going to ask the panelists as a moderator. And the last half, we're going to have you all, our audience, ask questions that will be answered by our panelists. So please feel free to submit questions to the Q&A button on your screen. You can do this at any point during the discussion that I'm having with the panelists, and we will be collecting those questions for the second section. The general chat box, on the other hand, is for making comments, and we will be closing that as soon as we start my questions to the panelists, and we'll open that back up for the second part of the discussion. If you're on social media, you're welcome to ask questions there, and we'll do our best to incorporate those into the questions from the Q&A box. We want to try to get to as many questions as possible. So panelists are going to try to keep the first part snappy so that we're able to have as much participation as possible. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get into the questions. So I'd love it if each of the panelists could begin by describing what drew you to democratic socialist analysis of public banking, and particularly postal banking.
Great, so I guess I'll start. Again, thank you all for having us. I think what drew me to it was a moment before I even knew about postal banking or, democratic socialists. I was actually my first summer job. My first paycheck, I took it to a check cashing establishment as opposed to a bank. I didn't really realize that it was a summer job, first paycheck. I didn't think about the cost that it took to cash that check with that establishment. And, I just got into the habit of that as I grew into different jobs. I would go and I wouldn't go into a bank because I didn't feel welcomed in the banking institution, walking into the door. So again, before I even knew anything about postal banking or DSA, I was living it in a sense. My family members, my friends, folks I work with now, still rely on payday lenders and check cashing establishments to, access their money. So it was just a life experience that drew me to it.
Thanks so much, CJ.
Would you like me to go next? I'm not sure if we have an order here or not. I would say what drew me to the idea of postal banking as a socialist was that, first of all, I was really inspired by the Occupy Wall Street movement when we saw the big banks crash the US economy. I was a letter carrier at the time, as I still am, and it very quickly had a ripple effect on the post office and caused us to have a great loss in revenue because of the way it crashed the economy in general. And at that point, you started hearing a narrative that the post office is going broke in 2011. And our union started fighting back and saying, well, no, post office isn't going broke. Congress is bankrupting it because of a ridiculous requirement to pre-fund retiree healthcare accounts 75 years in advance. So I got involved as an activist really at that time. I hadn't really been much of an activist before that. And that was in the fall of 2011. And I was also around that same time drawn to a socialist analysis of what was happening on our society in regard to what was happening economically and the continued prevalence of racism and sexism and all kinds of homophobia, transphobia in our society, and how that was all connected to capitalism. And when I started talking with other socialist activists who were organizing around the post office, they talked about the fact that there used to be postal banking. And when we talk about expanding postal services to make the post office more viable, and that was put forward by a lot of longtime union activists and socialists that I had the opportunity to organize with, it made perfect sense that the post office is here to provide a public service, and that should include financial services, because we can see what happens when the private sector takes over financial services and keeps people, excludes certain segments of our society from those services, and what an impact that has.
All right. I'm David Dayen, and I want to thank Dissent and the New Press and all the different partners on this call. Appreciate it. Thanks to DSA. I'm a journalist who's been writing about banks and finance and the economy for quite a long time, particularly got activated in that particular sphere around the financial crisis, wrote a lot about foreclosures and banks, and wrote a book on that entire operation. And so, my interests ranged in that area for some time. I was aware of the postal banking system that was present in the United States from 1911 to 1967. It was January of 2014 when this issue returned to the fore in our policy debates. And what happened then was that the Postal Service Inspector General wrote a white paper talking about this idea and the promise of it. And before that time, it was really not on the radar screen of anybody except, few random people here and there. But that made this something that was taken a little bit more seriously in the halls of Washington, and it really created a lot of attention and interest, and it certainly created mine. For several years, I wrote about the issue quite extensively, always found that people were super interested, and you know, it was kind of like a lightning bolt kind of subject. When people heard about it, they suddenly said, well, yes, that's so obvious. So you know, I did a panel on this with that Inspector General and several other people back in, I think, 2015. So I've been on this beat for quite a while, and now, obviously, when we see the attacks on the U.S. Postal Service, one of the largest employers in the United States, one of the most important systems for connecting commerce and connecting the nation together, this issue becomes even more important. So glad to be here to talk about it.
Thank you so much. That was a great kickoff. So for the second question, I want to get into your chapter a bit. So David's chapter, Building the People's Banks, starts with an analysis of how inequalities in the financial sector, including predatory lending and unregulated financial speculation, contributed to the Great Recession in 2008, which caused 8.9 million people to lose their jobs and at least 9.3 million families to lose their homes. David quotes Brad Miller describing that particular crisis as an extinction event for the Black and Latinx middle classes. If we understand that inequalities are reproduced by the market, how can we as socialists look to diminish the effects of inequality through building strong public services such as banking, education, healthcare, and a strong postal service?
Well, it's absolutely vital. You know, I think we should understand one thing here from the beginning. I think it sets up the whole discussion. The reason that I think we should have postal banking in the United States is not so the finances of the U.S. Postal Service are stabilized. We don't want to be in a situation where unbanked and underbanked people are now relied upon for the finances of a large operation. That's what got us in trouble during the financial crisis. That's what gets us in trouble with the private sector banking, that ordinary people are seen as profit centers and are exploited in numerous ways, whether you're talking about housing or whether you're talking about, you know, with the Wells Fargo fake account scandal and what they did there and all the various ways in which the giant rap sheet of Wells Fargo, you know, you don't want to be put in that position. The reason that we should have postal banking and the reason that it's so important is financial inclusion. So the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, does a study every few years of unbanked and underbanked people. And the most recent study, what they found is that roughly 1 in 4 households has little or no access to financial services. And in this day and age, that means you're living on a different plane of the economy. It's hard to get a job. It's hard to get a rent check. It's hard to rent a car. It's hard to do so many things if you have this unstable relationship to the financial system. And we want to promote financial inclusion. And the reason, there are a couple of reasons why the Postal Service is a great place to do that for commercial banking and consumer banking. I talk about some other types of banking in the chapter, but we'll just stay on consumer banking for right now. You know, one reason is that the alternative financial services that we see are incredibly exploitative. So the average income of those who are unbanked and underbanked is about $25,000 a year. And what we know is that roughly $2,000 a year, so about 10% of their gross income, not their take-home pay, their gross income is spent on interest and fees to these alternative financial services. So that's a tremendous amount of money that is simply being extracted from these people simply for the reason that they don't have access to the financial system. So, you know, getting them into a postal banking system that is not exploitative in any way is an important step. The second step is that banking, in this sense, particularly financial inclusion, fits into the model of the Postal Service and the mission of the Postal Service. The mission is to bind the nation together, to promote commerce, and to promote the connectivity of everybody throughout the country. There's no better way to do that than to ensure that everybody who has a bank account needs one, that everyone who has the need to receive assistance from the government, anyone who has the need to use their bank account for the purposes of a job or a home or whatever, is the fact that this service that has 35,000 branches all over the country in every zip code in America is a perfect spur for that. And it's not just convenience. It's really fits very well within the mission of the U.S. Postal Service. So I think those are important things to understand to kind of frame this discussion.
Thanks, David. That's a lot of really helpful information for our viewers. CJ and Melissa, would you like to follow up on those points?
Absolutely. Mr. David made a lot of great points. There are still families reeling from the impacts of the recession. You know, there are still working people who mistrust banks because of that, what happened in 2008, you know, the financial collapse. So those folks still don't have access to commercial banking, you know, for whatever reason, because they are, you know, not deemed as profitable by these banks. You know, they moved out of the communities, but also, again, the impacts of folks' credit reports, you know, the realistic on-the-ground things that have been happening to people, which make them mistrust banks. But we know the public does trust the Postal Service. And, you know, a lot of folks, I think what we've seen is a rise to alternative commercial banking, you know, like the internet sharing of money sharing and things like that, those databases. But, you know, the Postal Service remains something that is trusted by the people. And I think, you know, they would much rather walk into a post office and deposit money or withdraw money than I think they would a bank. And, you know, studies have shown that.
Thanks so much. Melissa?
Yeah, so I think that it's really important when we talk about the fact that this is a way to give access to people who have been excluded from commercial banks or been most taken advantage of by commercial banks, which is disproportionately Black and brown people. And I know Princeton professor Kiangi Yamada-Taylor recently had a book called Race for Profit, where she talked about a term called predatory inclusion, which is what banks did to Black families by loaning, you know, contract loans, and they were loans that were designed to fail. And it, you know, this goes back from decades, right? From when Black people were brought into the system to simply be exploited by it, you know, during the civil rights movement. And we saw that happen again with the Wall Street crash, where the foreclosures disproportionately again hit Black and brown neighborhoods. So if we want to talk about trying to address systemic racism, this would be one way to address systemic racism, where you had access to banking that is not predatory or based upon different rates or terms for people depending on where they live or their ethnicity, because the private sector has shown again and again that they will continue racist policies and policies that exclude people, exclude women, that exclude LGBTQ plus people. So I think that's really important that we emphasize that and see that as part of our analysis with this. I also think it's important when you think about the fact that the post office has been a place that's been able to offer people a pathway out of poverty, out of generational poverty, and you don't need a college education to get a job at the post office. And that this is the same idea of giving not necessarily jobs to people, but people who are in impoverished communities, a pathway away from commercialized banks that are looking to exploit them. And what I think is interesting though too, is recently I've seen it being published that JP Morgan Chase is trying to collaborate with Louis DeJoy to put their services into post offices. And it wouldn't be in conjunction with the post office. It would be separate, where they would lease space from the post office and basically offer, you know, their ATMs, which we all know have high fees, and other banking service. So it would be basically like them trying to take up space in a post office. And that would be a way to cut off postal banking before it starts, cut them off at the pass. And of course, they'll claim, well, this would be a way for the post office to make revenue. But it's not worth it when you look at the damage that it can continue to perpetuate in our communities.
Thanks, Melissa. I really appreciate that. You may have mentioned this, but just in case you didn't, for folks who don't know who DeJoy is, although he's been all over the news lately, he is the new Trump-appointed Postmaster General that we have all been talking about. So if folks hear him referenced, that is who we are talking about. So many of you have spoken a bit to question 3, but yes, this is about challenging inequality. I mean, at the very basic level here. For folks that don't know, currently 58% of post offices are in zip codes with 0 to 1 bank. It's pretty staggering. So if we are looking at the post office playing a role of challenging market inequality and offering a public banking option, I think it's important to recognize and talk a little bit about how it has played that role in the past, because this isn't some pie in the sky idea. Postal banking actually has been a part of the post office. So I'd love it if our panelists could speak to why things like postal saving accounts were discontinued in 1967 after decades of use.
Sure, happy to do that. I mean, there's 2 things we can talk about. First of all, the fact that we have had postal banking in the past, and that we still have financial services at the post office right now. So let's take those in turn. So as you said, in 1911, after a campaign that lasted for many years, decades, President Taft signed a postal savings account system bill that gave people this option. It was most attractive to immigrants, actually, who saw it in other countries in the world, in their home countries, and saw the postal service as a trusted source, and decided to use that system for banking. At the time, before the Depression, the Postal Service savings system was the only system that was really where the money was backed by the full faith and credit of the US government. This was before deposit insurance at the federal level. And so it was the safest alternative at that time. And after the Depression, it spiked in interest because of this very fact. The highest, I believe, was 4 million people had postal savings accounts in 1947. It was kind of a victim of its own success because the United States developed a deposit insurance system to make all banks as safe for their deposits as the Postal Service was. And so then it became a question of what are the benefits of a Postal Service savings system. The postal system paid 2% interest on these savings accounts, and rapidly throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, savings and loans operations started increasing their interest rate more and more and more, and money market systems as well. And it just became a better buy for people to get a higher interest rate outside the postal savings system. So it waned for about 20 years. And by the time that it was discontinued in 1967, it had already diminished pretty significantly in terms of its take-up. However, what did not diminish, and what continues to this day, are the financial services that the Postal Service already gives right now. Postal Service is a site of money orders, billions of dollars in money orders that are produced every single year. Still this year, even though it seems like something that's not a major facet, but it's still something that generates billions of dollars of support. I forget the exact name of it, but they have an international money transfer and remittance system through the United States Postal Service, through the Universal Postal Union. which I believe 12 mostly Latin American countries, you can remit and send money back home. The reason that a lot of postal banking can be done without additional authority from Congress is because these systems already exist and they can just be built upon. And by building upon them, then you can have many elements, not all of them, but many elements of a postal banking system. In fact, the American Postal Workers Union, in their last contract, had a clause where the USPS agreed to start pilot programs in 3 cities of postal banking style systems. They did not carry through on that. They agreed to it in a collective bargaining agreement and did not actually put forward these pilot programs. The APWU even picked the cities. One was going to be in the Bronx, one was going to be in, I'm forgetting the 2 other cities right now. But so not only can we get a postal savings system without Mitch McConnell being the barrier to it, but we have already put forward the steps to do 2 versions of a postal savings system. You know, Megan Brennan, who was the predecessor to Louis DeJoy, was no better on these issues and resisted putting forward these pilots, and more pressure needed to be put on her, and more pressure now needs to be put on DeJoy, especially, you know, not only to actually deliver the mail and change his systems so that it arrives to everybody's mailboxes on time, but also to live up to the commitments that were in this collective bargaining agreement. So yes, there's the past and there's also the present that argues for a postal banking system resumption.
Thanks so much, David. CJ or Melissa?
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit here too. I believe part of the decline in postal banking too was connected with the deregulation of big banks, and in the 60s under LBJ, and that as the big banks were deregulated, they were able to expand into places where they hadn't been before and open up more branches. So then you saw them going into more communities they hadn't been in the past, and more rural areas as well. And they also put pressure on LBJ to help shut down the postal banking, which had, as David mentioned, dwindled by that point. And what I find interesting is I'm from a rural area in Western Illinois, a small town, and you know, 1,000 people small. We're talking really small. And at that time, let's say late 60s, early 70s, you still had like a gas station in town, a bank, grocery store, you know, and a post office, right? Now, as the decades have gone on, you don't have those things anymore, thanks to expansion of like Walmart and businesses like that, Dollar Store General, that kind of thing. And now the only thing left again is the post office. You know, the gas stations are gone, the grocery stores are gone. So rural areas again are finding themselves in a place where they could use the expansion of postal banks. Now, over the past few years, a lot of them have seen a reduction in their postal office hours and cutbacks that were implemented to, you know, the guy that was a postmaster, Donahoe, who preceded Brennan, he made a lot of cuts to processing facilities, and part of that cut as well were to post office hours in rural areas. And you know, postal banking could definitely be used in rural areas where they don't have access to banking services. And I would also say that many other government services as well should be offered through these post offices, such as passport services. You know, people who live in rural areas shouldn't have to drive 50 to 100 miles to a passport office. There's some post offices already offer those services in larger cities. There isn't any reason every post office couldn't offer passport services, that they couldn't offer a high-speed internet kiosk to make secure payments for bills or other things, or that people couldn't expand these type of social services into a post office. So I think the postal banking too could be a key wedge, that once you institute that, then that opens the door for the argument of even more public services that should be offered to folks at their local post office.
Can I just step in just real briefly, because I went and looked it up. The other two cities where these pilot programs were supposed to be initiated was Baltimore and Cleveland. So you have Baltimore, Cleveland, and the Bronx. I put a link in the chat to a story that we did at the Prospect about this entire issue.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, David. CJ, would you like to add anything? Yes,
so Baltimore, I'm in Baltimore actually. I was one of the organizers with the Postal Workers Union who tried to get a pilot program off the ground. And we met some challenges, you know, not because folks weren't interested in postal banking, just trying to petition folks, and, you know, folks are less likely today to want to put their name on any clipboard that you give them and those type of things. But I think going back to the history of postal banking, what we saw was that once it ended, you know, that's when income inequality began to grow, and, you know, deindustrialization, factories began to shutter and move out of cities. They were, you know, that strength of the working class, you know, quieted down, should we say. I don't want to say we lost it. But, you know, so there were moments where, you know, they could have brought it back. I think right now would be a perfect time to bring it back again, as people are, you know, out of work, looking for secure ways to store their money, access their money without having to go into a bank, which they know their main goal is to gain a profit. You know, things like that are happening now and today. But, you know, in Baltimore, we try to get something going in Baltimore, Cleveland, and the Bronx. I think the Bronx, you know, because of the population, New York City is much more progressive, a more global city in a sense. You know, it caught more fire there. But officially, there hasn't been a city to really take up a pilot program of it as yet. And we're still trying, we're still pushing.
Thanks so much, CJ. So the last question has a couple different parts. So I hope each of you will take on various elements of it. But I think we have to talk about the post office being one of the leading employers of people of color in the US. And this attempt to privatize the post office that is currently underway, being led by the new Postmaster General, DeJoy. It is a part of capitalism's assault on workers of color. Right now, as David mentioned, about 10% of their gross income is being extorted by predatory lenders, and now they're trying to take one of the best job offers available to people in these communities. So in order to fight the inequality magnified by the financial sector, we have to talk about preserving these jobs and ensuring that the post office remains a public service accessible to all communities, which has come up a lot in this discussion so far. How can we conceptualize the fight for public banking going hand in hand with the fight to save the post office? How can these struggles be built together? And what lessons can and should we be drawing from the largest wildcat strike in US history, the postal workers' strike of 1970? Lots to chew on there, so feel free to jump at whatever part of that.
I'm happy to have somebody else start with that.
Well, I'd say first, making sure that when we talk about the Postal Service and saving the service, we include it in any conversation around infrastructure. Infrastructure is always a policy point of every major political party, but it's very rare that the Postal Service is included in that. And I think that, you know, including postal banking in that conversation around infrastructure, you know, especially right now, the Postal Service is everywhere. Over 35,000 locations. I mean, even being in a city like Baltimore, where 24% of the population is at or below the poverty line. You know, so for someone, I'm a living example of, you know, the power of the Postal Service as a place of employment. One of the largest unionized workforces left in the country. You know, one of those great balancers of power, economic power, political power, whatever type of power you really want to talk about. So me, I've been able to, get into conversations like postal banking because of the workplace I work at now. I've been able to advocate for people like me, my peers, family, neighbors, friends in Baltimore City who could who desperately need this type of service. So it's a twofold thing for me. I've been on the side of, again, the predatory payday lender, but I've also been on the side now of advocating for public banking options like postal banking.
Right. So I'll jump in here. Well, I think we have to be very clear and understanding that whenever, first of all, one of the last bastions of unionized workforce is in the public sector. And when you talk about attacks on the public sector and these union jobs, you're talking about attacks that disproportionately impact Black workers, workers of color. And I think you have to also include in that the fact that these public sector jobs that are union jobs that have benefits, you have equal pay for all of the workers. White men who deliver the mail are not paid more than women who deliver the mail, or Latina women have there's such a pay disparity in what Latino women get paid compared to white men to do the same work. That's not the case in the public sector and the post office. So when you're talking about attacking these jobs and the impact of austerity, where you cut public services and so that you can reduce the taxes on the rich, it has a disproportionate impact on communities of color, as well as basically every worker who's not a white man. That's the best way I can put it and most clear. So as a socialist, when you talk about an injury to one is an injury to all, right? That's one of, I think, the key tenets of socialism. And if you're going to look at attacks on public schooling, which we've seen, the attack on public healthcare and public hospitals, the attacks on the post office, this isn't just coincidence, right? It's an attempt to permanently lower the wage floor across the board for working people when you attack these jobs. And it also are the communities where these people live where it's most impactful, not just for the people that rely upon the services, but when you talk about, in the post office in particular, getting rid of 630,000 living wage jobs, those folks all spend money in the communities they live in. Now, if you expanded services for Amazon and you expand their amount of low wage workers, they aren't going to have the disposable income to spend in their communities like postal workers do. So to me, that's part of the big picture we should be looking at here. And and I mentioned this earlier as well, if we want to talk about addressing systemic racism, how do you attack the largest employer of unionized Black workers in this country? Because that's what the post office is. You're also talking about a disproportionate attack on veterans. There's almost 100,000 veterans employed by the Postal Service. When you're talking about our services, the VA sends out their medications through the post office. Medicare and Medicaid recipients, a good portion of them receive their prescriptions through the post office. 4.6 million prescriptions per day, 6 days a week are delivered by the post office. And this has also been at the forefront now because of these intentional delays that DeJoy has implemented. It's having a terrible impact on folks waiting for needed medications, whether it be insulin, cancer meds, whatever type of life-saving medication folks might need. And that also has a disproportionate impact on the people who can least afford to absorb that type of loss, because they can't just call up their provider and say, well, my medication hasn't gotten here. Can I just go to the pharmacy and pick it up? They're going to be told, no, you're just going to have to wait until it gets there. So all of these things are connected. And I think that's what's important about a socialist analysis, where you can see these impacts throughout the community, see how these attacks are systemic, and how and I would say it also provides a pathway for how we fight these attacks. And that would be through solidarity, through being explicit about the fact that this does have a racist impact. I don't think it does us any good to simply say, well, it's the right thing for our communities in general. I think we have to be explicit and call it out when we see it and say that this is racist. Austerity is racist. The attacks on the post office have a disproportionate racist impact. And if we can't simply say, let's add more services at the post office and racism is going to go away, I think we have to be explicit about the racist impact this has in our society. And it's part of a fight to have more equity in our society, which is, you know, obviously a continuing and ongoing struggle.
Thanks so much. And just in the last few minutes of this first section, David, do you want to jump in on any points?
Yeah. Let me just pick up on that, because I mean, what we're seeing with DeJoy is the really brutal logic of privatization and maybe of capitalism in terms of what he has brought into the fore. He has approached the issue of the Postal Service as I guess a private equity manager would. The agency is loaded up with debt, and how do you manage that problem? You cut costs to the bone. So what has he done? He's limited overtime, even though the post office is in a situation because it's understaffed, where if you limit overtime, you can't perform the basic functions of the job. And so what that means in normal business management 101 is that you lack staff. But what he's doing is cutting the overtime, as if the overtime is the problem and not the fact that you don't have enough people to do the job. So that's number one. Number two is he says, well, these trucks that go from the shipping centers over to the various post offices, they have to run on time. Even if they have no mail in them, they have to run on time, because otherwise we waste time going back and forth and we waste money. And I'm looking at this for efficiencies and labor, cutting of costs, and everything has to run on time. And that has caused this dramatic drop in on-time delivery, something on the order of about 10%, which started in July. I mean, his defenders have said, well, it's because of the pandemic and all these postal workers are off in quarantine. No, you see the actual charts that show that the pandemic started in March. Everything was still going pretty much fine on-time delivery. And then it falls off a cliff as soon as he makes these operational changes in July. So what this kind of shows is that when you have an individual looking at this through a business capitalist lens, when it's a universal public infrastructure that is essential infrastructure for the entire country, then that's what gets diminished in the aftermath. There was a hearing in the Senate, and DeJoy was asked, did you know that you've cut all these sorting machines, and now there's only one sorting machine in the state of New Hampshire, serving all the residents of the state of New Hampshire? What happens if that machine breaks? And it did. It did break in the last week or so. And he said, well, I think we have enough sorting machines to do the job. He's, of course, looking at the job now under COVID, when you have actually mail volumes dropping, and not building redundancy into the system. If this is essential infrastructure, you have to have more than one sorting machine in case one breaks like that. But he's looking at it through a business capitalist lens and not as a public service. And so, what you're seeing with what DeJoy is instituting is exactly what you would see under a regime of privatization. Areas that are out of the way, that costs a lot of money to get mail to, would simply not be serviced. Areas that, where business costs would take primacy over getting the service out to everybody. And these have dramatic effects, as Melissa talked about. Medicines, people turning in rent checks, all sorts of dramatic impacts from this slowdown, this deliberate slowdown. And so I think that's a really good lens to take this discussion in, because it really talks about what the logic of privatization is. And another part of that logic is what we talked about before, and this is the last thing I'll say, with JP Morgan approaching the Postal Service and saying, why can't we put some machines, ATM machines, in your facilities? I mean, that is simply a rental of space within the Postal Service for this predatory actor. That's similar to like how Chicago sold its parking meters. Didn't care what the private company, the privatization that bought the parking meters would do, charging exorbitant rates, not closing on festival days and things like that. But all they cared about was getting a little bit of money in the door, which is all DeJoy cares about, getting a little money in the door to rent out this space, and what happens in that space, not my problem anymore. So this is the logic of privatization. This is the logic of business capitalism, and it's being overlaid on an essential public piece of infrastructure, and that's just wrong.
Can I follow up real quick on something that David just mentioned? Because I think it's kind of important for people to understand this, because when you talk about the cutting of overtime of workers, in general, a lot of areas of the country are short-staffed in postal workers, of letter carriers and clerks already. So on an average year, they might use 15% of the hours postal-wide. 15 to 20% are the figures I hear are overtime hours, right? So that's higher than a lot of private sectors would be, but it's because they've actually, tried to cut the workforce so thin that there's not much margin for error there. So now you add that with the pandemic, where they've had to quarantine at least 40,000 postal workers since the start of this pandemic. You're talking about an even increased need of overtime. And part of the reason we need overtime in the post office is because we get the mail out. It doesn't sit. Whatever comes in goes out, whether that be into the plant and out of the plant, which is why they hold trucks, and trucks don't always leave on time. Because why, if the mail isn't done being sorted, why would you send the truck? That's not efficient. I mean, that's the mind of a privatizer who has no postal experience and says it makes, oh, well, if the truck leaves on time, that solves the problem of leaving late. Well, no, it doesn't, because now the truck is empty and they're disciplining workers who are not, if they don't leave on time, and they don't want to leave on time because they don't have any mail in their truck, and they know that this kind of flawed logic makes no sense. And the same thing goes, I work outside Chicago. We have incredible weather conditions here, whether it be cold or heat. And then you throw in when people are sick, people are quarantined. Now we have longer days. And if someone else doesn't show up to do their route, I work 2 to 4 hours extra to help, cover those routes, as do my coworkers. We don't leave that route undelivered that day. Every route goes out every day. In almost 25 years of delivering mail, I can think of like maybe 3 days in my postal career where our routes didn't go out on days they were supposed to. And that was because of polar vortexes that were literally killing people. So this whole idea is an anathema to postal workers that we would intentionally delay mail because we know what's coming tomorrow. If we delay it today, it's just going to make things even worse tomorrow. So it's really important for people to understand that. And when we talk about taking these sorting machines out of plants, now you did have machines working 10 to 12 hours a day without the extra machines. Those machines are now working maybe 20 hours a day with no break. So they're going to break down more. You don't have extra machines to replace them when they break down or take parts from when they break down. This is a very real issue. It's coming directly from the workers that this is what's happening. So we have to understand kind of the big picture here of the lasting impact of these changes. The overtime might somewhat come back, but he already said he's not putting these machines back. so it's going to be a fight if we want to try to get some of these machines put back. And like David said, an excess capacity and a redundancy is what you need in a system like the Postal Service.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of that incredibly insightful information. And I know audience members have questions about a lot of the things that just came up. So we are going to go ahead and transition over to the audience questions. We're also turning the chat box back on so people can feel free to utilize that. So we're going to go ahead and get to as many questions as we possibly can. Just really quickly to give a little bit of context to this. This event was initially scheduled to talk about postal banking and obviously has come more and more into contact with what has been happening on a daily basis with the Postmaster DeJoy and his attempts to dismantle postal services. I think that Melissa spoke very well to. Just so people know, in the past week, we have had two nationwide actions. The one on Saturday had over 800 actions across the country to save the post office. And the one on Tuesday had 600 different actions around this country. So the fight is really heating up. These are not separate issues. We'll definitely be tackling them as one and the same here with your audience questions. And we will be talking at the very end about which groups you can get involved with to be a part of the struggle. So please stick around and join in that struggle with us. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and transition to the questions. So the first question that I have is, what are the important lessons and takeaways that we can learn from actions in support of the Postal Service, especially as we organize for a more equitable and just future?
Okay, I'd like to take that one. I would say, you know, one of the most democratic institutions in the country is the Postal Service. I think that's what we can take away from a lot of the actions we've seen. I know in Baltimore, we've seen community associations, neighborhood groups, different organizations, you know, progressive organizations hosting these type of events. You know, so what we're seeing is they are actually delivering the message that this Postal Service belongs to us. They've even shown up at the Postmaster General's condo in DC and his actual home in North Carolina. So, you know, the people are the shareholders in the Postal Service, not some, you know, dark money place somewhere like that. You know, the people are the shareholders, and now they are saying, look, you're not going to, you know, take in the middle of the night this service that we all depend on.
Yeah, I just briefly say that the public outcry about this has rocked back the Postmaster General and their defenders within the Republican Party to at least rhetorically play defense. Whether or not the changes or the reversal of certain policies that DeJoy has said he will make needs to be verified, but he is very firmly on the defensive right now, and that's entirely a function of the work that individuals have done to really call out what was going on.
I see a question in the chat box too from Peg Strobel about, could you say something about post office relationship with Amazon and FedEx? One thing I would say is that FedEx and UPS have maybe 30% of their parcels delivered by the post office. And that's not just in rural or remote areas. It's in cities and suburban areas as well. And that's because those companies make more money on their non-residential deliveries. So they try to shift as much of their residential deliveries as possible to the post office, since we're already going to those houses. And that way they save a lot of money on labor of having their drivers deliver them. And when you talk about Amazon, every day, the Amazon parcels at the post office are getting fewer and fewer because Bezos is expanding his own delivery network. I get very few, I have a pretty large, like maybe 500 resident route in a large suburban area. And I get almost no Amazon packages during the week. We get them on Sundays because every day I see the Amazon driver who's probably making maybe a third as much money as me per hour delivering these packages. So when Trump talks about how the post office could just charge Amazon 4 times as much, that's ridiculous, because our Amazon packages are dwindling. And we also, I can say that Bezos would love nothing more than to see the post office collapse and be sold off, because he could expand his network to postal facilities, you know, buy them up with pennies on the dollar wherever he needs to expand. So, you know, those would be kind of my comments about Amazon, FedEx, UPS.
Great, thank you. So someone here asked, they said, as Melissa mentioned, while Wall Street banks are closing brick and mortar banks in low income and rural communities, JP Morgan is in conversation with PM DeJoy, Postmaster DeJoy, about opening up ATMs like we talked about. And they're saying that French and other postal banking systems are tied to private banks. What do our panelists think about public-private partnerships?
You know, it is a function of certainly a lot of things in our government way of thinking. I think not always to the good. A lot of postal banks globally, a lot of postal services globally are privatized, and the banking systems within them as well. I'm not sure that that's entirely necessary here, although I believe that you know, there will be a secondary fight if we do get postal banking in place. There will be a secondary fight as to whether it will be done, you know, through some sort of service provider rather than by postal workers themselves. This fight has already been taken on in a different context a few years ago, when Staples stores had postal services placed within them, and non-union workers were engaging in, I believe, shipping services through the Staples offices. They were taking the position of being postal workers without being unionized and part of the Postal Service. There was tremendous pushback, and eventually that system got shut down. It was kind of a pilot system. So, you know, I think you got to kind of walk before you can run. You want to put the pilots in place. You want to show that this system can work with a sufficient deposit base that will enable the Postal Service to have interest-bearing accounts and a network between one another of delivering, like a Venmo style delivering of money, and then maybe down the road you institute small loans to take away from payday lenders, and do it in an equitable way. I think once you prove the concept, then we can have the fight over whether you know, put it in the private hands.
CJ or Melissa, any brief thoughts on that?
Briefly, I mean, I guess it's the millennial in me, but I don't want any private company or anything introduced into or connected with public banking. And I think David touches on the great, and we on the future in his chapter, where, you know, having those, the traditional commercial banking services is separated as much as possible from the financial sector as it is now, with the trading and the derivatives and all that type of stuff, which I'm not really well versed on. But, you know, a public-private thing, I want it to be all public. You know, that would be the goal. So me, I would be against something like that, but I do understand the need to kind of show proof and show it could work. It may require something like that, but eventually moving to a completely public bank, or, you know, in the hands of people.
One thing I would just add is that one great way to do this is through giving everybody a bank account at the Federal Reserve. There's a great paper called the Fed account. The Postal Service could then be the sort of storefront for these Fed accounts, a way to have ATMs or you know, customer service or what have you. But if you had everybody with a secure account at the Federal Reserve, I mean, think about the delivery of all of these checks that we did, these stimulus checks, $1,200 checks, and how difficult it was, and how if people had debts at commercial banks, banks were able to seize those stimulus checks. I wrote a piece about that. If you had a Fed account, it would be a keystroke and everybody would have the $1,200. There would be absolutely, it would be completely and 100% seamless. And you could see this as a recession fighting tool that, oh, we're into recession, time to give $400 to everybody through a keystroke. So the Fed account is a really great way to think about this. The Federal Reserve gives super cheap loans to every bank in America. There's no, and they provide concierge services to the financial sector. There's no reason they can't do so for every individual. It would not be a strain on them. I'm going to put in the chat the link to a paper that was done by 2 former Treasury Department officials about the Fed account. And it's a great way to operationalize this idea without having to bring on a private sector.
Okay, great. We have a lot more questions, so I just want to make sure that we go ahead and get to those. So someone just asked, how feasible would it be for postal workers to work without approval to get ballots sent? They said, I've read that there are some stations where sorting machines were put back online, which we've talked a little bit about so far, without managerial approval. Is it possible to do something like that with the ballots as organizing and resistance continues to increase?
I'll jump in on that real quick. I know I was at a rally yesterday in Chicago, and when the NALC Branch 11 president, Mac Julian, was speaking, he said, I want to assure everybody that your ballots by mail are going to be delivered where they're supposed to be delivered. I can guarantee you postal workers are highly motivated to see that these ballots get where they're going on time. And I have to agree with him on that one, whether it be in plants or those of us that are picking up those ballots and outgoing mail. We're going to make sure that those get processed and that they don't get delayed, because we know how important it is to democracy, especially during a pandemic, to see that people get the opportunity to vote. So I know that workers are going to be doing everything. And I think that's why you already saw the outcry, this public outcry was generated by postal workers sharing information and pictures with the public and the media, which they were not supposed to do, going against Postal Service policy and releasing the facts of how this stuff was being delayed. So now that DeJoy can see that his chicanery is exposed, he's going to have to implement changes to see that those kind of things don't continue. Otherwise, the workers will address it. We've already seen that happen.
And just for a second on that, because Courtney and Melissa can speak better to this, but if you just look at the numbers here, there are 153 million registered voters in the United States. If you say half of them will request an absentee ballot this year, which would be a huge number because not everybody votes, right? Let's just say an outrageous number, like half of all registered voters request an absentee ballot. So that's like, let's say 80 million. The post office delivers 472 million pieces of mail every day. 80 million ballots is not going to be a hardship unless there is some chicanery to make it a hardship. So that's the real point here.
CJ, do you have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I think David touched on it perfectly. We are more than capable of, handling the volume, the anticipated volume. One processing facility like the one I work in, they process 1 million pieces of letters a night. Or, no matter, imagine over the span of a few weeks. A very real situation that happened in my facility, postal workers, we are dedicated. And when ballots come in on those trucks, we see them, they're tagged in a certain way, they're identified in a certain way. And, we have union members on the work floor, and they care about their job, and they care about giving access, make sure people have access to the ballot. So when those skids of ballots come on those trucks, we see them, we notify the person to get them off the truck, get them on the processing machine so we can get them back out to the local post office. So there are people on the ground, as Sister Melissa said, even her local president, we are dedicated to what we do and we take pride in what we do. And this, even more so now, it's kind of like we've been challenged in a way. And you don't challenge postal workers because we'll meet the challenge and we'll exceed the challenge. But, you know, we are more than capable of handling the election mail that's going to be coming in November.
One of the numbers I heard is that it would be like maybe a 2% increase in when the ballots come through, if they all came through, you know, in a short time period, which is nothing. We handle over 1.3 billion Christmas cards every December. So it's like a drop in the bucket for us if we're not being kneecapped.
One of our listeners was asking, what can we do to address these issues in a region that is mostly Republican? And I would just tack onto this question, the rural versus urban question in relationship to these postal questions and the dismantling of the postal system.
Well, I mean, we know that Postal Service is, if anything, more essential in rural America than it is in other parts of the country. It's a node of the health system in rural America, where rural hospitals are few and far between, and a lot of people get their prescription drugs that way. It's you know, the part of the government that you see every day, and that and they go the extra mile to help people with any manner of needs. It's the one, you know, piece of government infrastructure left in these towns in many cases. So that is why, by the way, you know, Congress came back and voted on reversing all these changes to the Postal Service, and 26 Republicans voted with all the Democrats on that. Historically, because of this incredible need in rural America and their reliance on the Postal Service, Republicans traditionally have been supporters. And many of them, not all of them, but many of them have been supporters of the Postal Service. So I think there is room to do a lot of organizing on this in rural America.
Yeah, I have to agree with David on that. As I said earlier, I grew up in a rural area. My dad's a farmer. And when you're talking about family farms, a lot of farmers aren't just farmers, they're also mechanics, and they have to fix their own equipment. And they have to order parts because, you know, there might not be an equipment dealer nearby, whether it be through Granger or whomever. They get those parts through the mail, and they rely on it through the mail. Anyone who raises livestock gets medicine and treatments for their livestock through the mail. They might not have a local vet that is convenient, right? So just as humans have prescriptions, so do animals. So anyone that raises livestock relies upon the mail to get needed medicines for their animals as well. And so it really, in a lot of these rural towns, the post office is the last connection to the outside world in a lot of aspects of direct communication. And it's also a social center. You know, my aunt was a postmaster in the local post office, and people come in and visit, they talk, find out what's going on, discuss what's going on in the world. It's not seen as some type of a partisan issue that, you know, everybody loves their post office. And, you know, I remember growing up, our rural route carrier, Happy, right, that would always like give kids candy and stuff on the route. And, you know, it's just part of the fabric of this nation. No matter where you're at, whether you're in, you know, the inner city or whether you're in a rural area, it's something that is crucial and relied upon by everybody.
CJ, anything to throw in, or?
Yeah, just to say, especially for rural communities, but, you know, even the urban communities like Baltimore, communication is so important in these times. And I mean, even right now, there are people who don't have access to this panel that we're doing, that don't have internet access, from the urban city to the, rural community in Western Maryland where I live at. But that person in that rural community can get a copy of the Dissent magazine delivered to their home. You know what I mean? Like a very literal thing, but they may not be able to see this panel, but they can read a piece in an article from a physical magazine that they are still getting because their rural letter carrier is delivering it to them. And again, we talk about school reopenings and the digital divide. Even that, the post office could be a hotspot, internet hotspot for communities everywhere. So not only will we offer postal banking, but hey, come in and enjoy some free internet while you're here, right? Those type of things.
Because CJ brought it up, I'm going to do a quick plug. Our issue cover of the current issue of Dissent is of a letter carrier delivering a ballot, and the address on that ballot is in the Midwest. That was a very intentional decision. Anyone who's watching this event tonight can get 25% off subscription. Someone will drop the link for that into the chat box, but Dissent is 100% behind its postal workers, and we're very excited to have that on the cover of our issue. So I'm just going to take two more quick questions and then we're going to wrap up tonight. One, I'm going to break protocol a little on and ask/answer before throwing it to the broader group. Just given, like I said in the beginning, I am involved in this postal organizing myself. So a number of folks have asked about the relationship between the fight for postal banking and the current movement around saving the post office. When you have this many people in the streets, what is the importance of fighting for postal banking now? And especially, like, how could it be advantageous during COVID? And I want to say, like, in thinking about structuring this panel, we see these things as one and the same, right? There is an attempt to use things like COVID or any kind of disaster as an attempt to clamp down and do away with public services in this country. This is part and parcel of how capitalism functions. It wants to dismantle public services. They are not profitable. It wants to privatize everything. We've seen it with education. After the 2008 crisis, there was a war on public education, and it has been up to teachers and workers in those schools and communities to fight that battle, just like it is up to us as a community to fight to keep the post office a public service. And in fighting to expand what the post office offers as a public service, it is going to help strengthen the existence of the post office as a public institution, keep it from being privatized, keep it from exacerbating inequalities like we've talked about tonight, exacerbating racial inequalities, exacerbate inequalities for rural communities that don't have access to getting medication and supplies in these other fashions like we've talked about. It's really about ensuring equitable and just options for our communities. Like we said, 58% of our communities, of our zip codes do not have banks, but they do have post offices, and that is because those communities lose money by having post offices, but because it's public, they have a post office. So it's just to say we see these issues that's as part of the same thing, and that is why we structured this panel this way. And I want to go ahead and give the other panelists an opportunity to answer that as well. Just because the chapter that I wrote, candidly, is a little broader than postal banking, and I've actually seen some people who are in the audience from the Public Banking Institute, which is a slightly different concept. I wanted to shout them out, and something else you can work on. Postal banking is really about consumer banking and access to financial services. The real adversary there, it's not really actually commercial banks who don't want this business at all. It's payday lenders and check cashing stores and these horrible predatory alternative services. Public banking is a little different, and that's a way that we can sort of socialize our tax dollars and put them into a publicly run bank that then finances infrastructure projects, student loans, all sorts of different material, because tax revenue doesn't just immediately come in and go out. It needs to be held for a while, and then that money can be put to use. There are people from the Public Banking Institute, which is probably the finest organization on this. There is a public bank in North Dakota, Bank of North Dakota. After the financial crisis, no
commercial banks in North Dakota failed because the public bank in North Dakota works with community lenders in that community to thrive that community, and it has raised record profits, public profits, every year for the last 15 years, and that money gets cycled back into treasuries and then, you know, back out into the community. It's a terrific system. I urge you to read up on it. I've written about it. And I know that there are efforts in California, in New Jersey, all over the country, really, for people to take this model of public banking in North Dakota, and instead of communities, municipalities, borrowing all this money and spending tons of money on interest, to use a public bank, to use our local money and keep it in our community, and use that for the betterment of the community, rather than throwing it into a bank like Wells Fargo that exploits people, or Bank of America, what have you. So I just wanted to bring that up as another example of democratizing the financial system.
And when you look at what's happened recently with the first round of stimulus money going out, and banks being a middle broker between the government and the people receiving that money, these big banks took huge cuts of that money for themselves, even though, you know, just for pure profit, right? You saw small businesses elbowed out and not able to get access to that stimulus funding because big lenders already had open lines of credit with these private banks who funneled the money directly to them before the small businesses even had a chance to get their applications in. So when you talk about a public banking system, you would talk about a distribution of funds and an allocation of funds that would be more democratic and be able to get into the hands of the people that need it most. I mean, some of these companies got, I know FedEx and UPS, for one, both got stimulus funding, not loan money, but stimulus money. And I'm sure they've had increased costs due to COVID as well. But the idea that somehow FedEx and UPS would be worthy of stimulus funding, but the post office isn't, it does not make sense, right? Unless you're, which obviously this was the case, you had private big corporations who were prioritized over the needs of the people. And you're funding those corporations before you're looking at small businesses and individuals. And how is it that you have money to dole out to these big corporations, but you don't have money so that you make sure there aren't delays in the mail so that elderly people and infirm people and veterans can get their medications during a pandemic without having to risk their health or the health of others by going into a pharmacy?
Okay, we have time for one more question. And this is something someone raised in the general chat, but I felt like it was important to get it in here. So someone asked, how do we make sure expanding activities of the Postal Service isn't used as a tool for expanding policing and surveillance of Black and poor communities that come to rely on these postal services?
That's a great question, actually, because there is a level of security that must be in place when we make monetary transactions and things like that. But I think it's working people like myself who work at the counters, you know what I mean, who are going to be the eyes and the ears for the community, which we already are. You know, letter carriers are some of the emergency responders in many of the communities that we do serve and we do reach. You know, so just making sure that, again, it's understood as being democratic and inclusive from the beginning, from the onset. One of the reasons why we would want something like this is to welcome all people in. Again, you know, I'll go back to one of my first comments on the panel was I didn't feel comfortable walking into a banking institution when I first got my first paycheck. You know, but postal workers, again, like myself, like Sister Melissa, you know, offering that extra layer of oversight, should we say. So those discriminatory things we see in traditional banks aren't necessarily coming into our post offices. I think that's a good place we could start.
I would just add that one of the things about creating a postal banking system is that because it's a government agency, it would be covered by the Privacy Act of 1974. And that means your data couldn't actually be sold. What we know is that there's an enormous amount of data brokering that goes on with your personal financial information. It's sold to people who then, you know, try to sell you other various ads and services and things. And that actually, by law, could not be done under a postal banking system. So if anything, the privacy and surveillance aspects of it would be much more secure in postal banking than it is right now in the current private banking system.
Yeah, I think Courtney makes a really important point here when he's talking about the fact that when folks go into a post office, the people working there are going to look more like the communities that they live in, as opposed to maybe what the staff at your local corporate bank looks like. So you're not going to have the same kind of profiling of customers like you would in the private sector. Because that does matter, right? And you also don't see a huge, I mean, it's not that there's never any type of crime that goes on around the post office by any means, but people do have a certain respect for the post office and their carriers and the people that work in those places, and understand that it serves the community. So they generally don't target it for crime like private businesses might be targeted. So I think that makes a difference as well. And I also think that when you're talking about labor unions that represent a workforce that's very diverse, when we're advocating for these changes in our job place, we're going to make sure that there's things put into place in there to make it more equitable for everyone. And you know, we don't need a law to even institute a lot of these postal banking measures. So that's really important. And I think it's great that our unions have taken up the flag for postal banking, because it shows you how powerful unions can be, not when they look beyond just advocating for bread and butter issues of their members and not just wages, but when you talk about the positive impact you can have on your entire community, and that rising tide helps lift all boats. And that should be a key function of any labor union. It is bargaining for the public good and bargaining for the communities we serve.
That's a fantastic place to leave it. Thank you so much. I apologize for any questions that we were not able to get to tonight. We tried to balance it across all topics. I want to thank everyone that was involved in bringing this event together. Our panelists, David Dayen, Melissa Rakestraw, and Courtney C.J. Jenkins. To our audience, our interlocutors who will be receiving our follow-up emails about upcoming events. Thank you so much for your great questions and comments. And thanks to everyone you can't see who's been working behind the scenes. Emily Janakiram for the New Press, Michael Bennett and Sunshine Ryan Letter, and Michael Grakowski from the DSA Fund. We hope that learning more about the fight for postal banking will make you want to get involved. And like I mentioned in the middle, there are many ways to get involved. I'm going to name some right now. There is a campaign for postal banking that is ongoing. You can support the Democratic Socialist Labor Commission, which I am a part of, the DSA for USPS campaign. If you are a member of DSA, you can join the DSLC's USPS subcommittee. We meet once every 2 weeks. Also, please consider subscribing and supporting independent media. You can support Dissent, Labor Notes, and the American Prospect, all of which are co-sponsors of tonight's event. If you're on Facebook, you can like and follow the pages of the American Postal Workers Union Local 181 CJ's branch, the Save Our Postal Service page, and the Save Our Post Office page. Support the unions that Melissa and CJ belong to, the National Association of Letter Carriers and the American Postal Workers Union. Read David Dayen's continued updates, unsanitized in the American Prospect, and the other articles that he linked in the chat. And please check out We Own the Future. It's got a lot of other amazing chapters that we will continue to go through. And we look forward to talking more with you about those chapters in the future. Thank you so much.